right. Hopefully, yeah, the stream's working. It's been a while since I last tried out streaming anything, so hopefully I'm doing doing it right. So yeah, I decided to just pretty much read a couple of essays written by Bob Black. Bob Black is an anarchist writer. Um, I don't have like an extensive biography of him, but I think he's still alive. He's probably older. He's been writing since the '80s, and I really like the way he kind of explains things. I'm not very good at kind of getting my thoughts together in a in a way that's very conducive to communicating them, I guess. So, I just wanted to share some of these essays of his, and then maybe at the end I'll give some commentary of my own. So, I guess, yeah, so lately, I kind of, got sucked into following, more of the political mainstream news and shit like that, or not just mainstream really, but people commenting on obviously the elections and shit like that. I mean, that's where we're at. Um, After I had been ignoring them for a while, a long time. Even I think the last election I wasn't really paying much attention to, or the last, I mean, the midterms, who gives a fuck about the midterms, in general, but the last, even, in 2020, I don't think I was paying that much attention, but, lately I kind of, what, mainly for entertainment purposes, for me, just kind of got into watching people who are commenting on it, and and this and that and all that stuff. Um, and I kind of, have realized that my perspective is still not really out there that much. I haven't, at least the people I've come across, still just have a very different approach to, the political system and voting and all of that. Even though they're coming at it, most of the people that I've, gotten into the habit of watching, are, they're not like the most normie mainstream people who are in, obviously the one of the two major camps, but they're still, their approach is still, I would say, pretty adjacent to it. Whether they're people who are, advocating for third parties or independent candidates and things like that, or just their other opinions in general about elections and politics and whatnot. So I just have maybe felt like it's kind of getting kind of redundant for me and kind of boring to see just like the similar approaches being taken of mocking the two party system, which is fine. I'm obviously not into those parties and all that, but at the same time it's a little repetitive of just like playing off one against the other. There's a lot of that now. Obviously there's a lot of at least the circles I'm um, in, there's a lot of people who are basically people who used to be um, more associated with like the Democratic Party, or what, whatever you want to call it, the so-called left, or that whole milieu, people who maybe supported people like Obama or Bernie Sanders, or whoever, and people who have basically like become embittered, by the things that have happened or not happened, as the case may be, coming out of those different political ventures, and who now are pretty kind of just in a really bitter place about the Democrats, and they spend a lot of time kind of focusing on that, which is fine. It makes sense. But at the same time, it's like still pretty limited. It's like, if either there's people who just totally are like, oh, I'm just gonna vote Republican now, and which or there's people who are like I said, voting third party, and things like that. But so to me, that's still just pretty limited. Either jumping from one major party to the other major party, or even getting into like the independent third party type people. That's kind of all I've seen represented for the most part, and to me is pretty limited. So I just wanted to for whatever it's worth, kind of put another perspective out there that goes pretty far beyond just focusing on that milieu in whichever direction people are in. So I'll go ahead and start reading the first essay. This one's shorter, the other one's a little longer, not extremely long, so we'll see. But yeah, so I'll stop talking for now and I'll go ahead and read. So the first one is called Electing Not to Vote by Bob Black, and I guess it was written in 1982 or 1985, maybe revised in 85. So okay, so electing not to vote. If elections are, as Sartre said, a trap for fools, then recent voting trends are in hopeful contrast with other signs of social somnolence. Not that election results are getting any better. They never will, so long as anybody wins. The good news is the steady growth of the non-voting majority of eligibles, which has been, quote-unquote, winning elections for over 60 years. In place of majority rule, we see an increasingly unruly majority. The 1984 presidential election, the Comet Kohoutek of recent politics, should have sharply reversed the trend. In fact, it only stalled it. Despite a flashy ideological incumbent, despite the antics of Jesse Jackson, the preacher from the Black Lagoon, despite the saliency of the nuclear war issue and a vote-or-die terror campaign by frantic leftists, and despite the relative decline in the size of the low turnout, youngest age groups, most eligible voters, as usual, found better things to do. For a system which makes majority rule the bywords and buzzwords of state-of-the-art statism, a chronic crisis simmers which, for once, will hurt them more than it hurts us. It seems like the easier the authorities make it for their subjects to consecrate their coercion with their votes, the less response to their come-on. They ended poll taxes and literacy tests. They enfranchised minorities and 18-year-olds. They provided bilingual ballots, but no one votes less often than the beneficiaries of these reforms. Quote-unquote democracy, observed Karl Kraus, quote, means the permission to be everybody's slave, unquote. Its claimed superiority over other oppressive arrangements remains, after centuries of philosophy and propaganda, obscure. That an abstract, evanescent majority, of whom is one of the central mysteries of democratic dogma, could ever claim more than the right to rule itself has always been a gross impertinence. Yet liberals and the leftists who tail them assure us, with a straight face, that those who participate in elections thereby agree to abide by the outcome, whereas those who abstain have no right to complain since, after all, they could have voted. This ritual, they assure us, magically expands the scope of legitimate authority, i.e. cop violence. Beware of Democrats offering rights. Such sophistries stand out in their proper satirical light when, year in and year out, the majority refuses to rule. What do I care if some cabal of ambitious opportunists declares me a member of some club I don't want to join? Majority rule, shaky enough as a quote-unquote right, is openly malignant when imposed by a minority as a duty. Ralph Darth Nader is only a step ahead of his fellow paternalists in calling for compulsory voting. The composition of the non-voting majority is disturbing to our overlords. Liberals and leftists, when they're not gushing slush about the wisdom of the people, when they're not promising succor to the downtrodden, with typical cynicism defame non-voters, hitherto mainly poor, minority, and foreign-born, as stupid, uneducated, and indifferent to their civic responsibilities, if not downright un-American. But by now the voting drop reflects the ongoing coming of age of new eligibles who never do acquire the voting vice, and the attrition of those of their elders who never kick the habit. Most aren't conscious refuseniks, but their absence from the rolls today just may prefigure refusal of the rolls tomorrow. Naturally, the hamster-wheeler dealers of the left deliver the loyalists who make the system work for all their rejective rhetoric. So do the misnamed libertarians, some of whom hallucinate that they're anarchists. For that matter, more than a few avowed quote-unquote anarchists slunk into voting booths in 1984 and anarcha-feminist quote-unquote imagine, set in context, endorsed Mondale in the pages of Circle A in Atlanta, prompting Ted Lopez to ask, what does the A really stand for? More usually, these loyal oppositionists serve up pathetic no-win third parties, which offer a quote-unquote choice. The choice, having gone to the bother of voting in the first place, of making absolutely certain, not just 99.99% certain, of wasting one's vote. Proposals to reward voters with green stamps make more sense. Why not enfranchise pigeons and offer them pellets? The real meaning of don't waste your vote is don't cast it. The many parties solicit votes as a form of quote-unquote protest, but as a medium of expression. A can of spray paint has it all over any election. As conformist as voters are, no two of them mean precisely the same by their votes, even if cast for the same candidate. Yet the votes as tallied are anonymous, impersonal, and interchangeable. A vote once cast is cast away. It then belongs to the pundits and politicos to make what they will of it. And a candidate, once elected, will tell you what to do, no matter what went before. You can't protest fundamentals by voting. Voting is bound up with them. There's no such thing as voting against voting. Contrary to the anthill collectivists, it's stupid to say non-voting is a merely personal, quote-unquote, individualistic gesture. What could be more privatized and isolated than casting a secret ballot, evidently designed for people with something to hide, all by yourself, which acknowledges your status as replaceable part of a polity you never asked to belong to? Collective action against electoral alienation is fully as feasible as running for office, but strangely, it holds no appeal for power-hungry, quote-unquote, progressives. No need to address the populist reforms. Initiative, referendum, recall, etc., contrived to outflank corporate control of the state. At best, they never worked that way. At worst, they became the vehicle for regressive, quote-unquote, reforms like California's Proposition 13, which were KY'd into the body politic by moneyed cabals who buy the mass media. As with the Ptolemaic system, the effort to rectify the electoral system with epicycles invariably went awry. The crisis of democracy transcends all gimmickry. Every politician's quote-unquote platform is a scaffold. Which of two fungible fakers assumes a particular office is a matter of decreasing relevance to reality. A voter is far more likely to be hit by a car on the way to the polls than he is of affecting the outcome of an election, to say nothing of changing real life. How much lower will the vote totals go before the quote-unquote winners are ashamed or afraid to take office? People aren't as stupid as the politicians think. More and more of us are laughing off our quote-unquote civic duty to vote, rejecting the role of compulsory constituent. What if they gave an election and nobody came? We'll find out pretty soon. And so that's the end of the first essay. And I'll go ahead and jump to the second one. Before I comment, I'll probably just save my comments until after I read this one. So this one is Debunking Democracy by Bob Black, and apparently written in 2011. Debunking Democracy. For the first time in history, nearly everyone today professes to be a Democrat. Professors profess democracy profusely, although they keep it off campus. Democracy, truly, that word can mean anything. Even North Korea calls itself a democratic people's republic. Democracy goes with everything. For champions of capitalism, democracy is inseparable from capitalism. For champions of socialism, democracy is inseparable from socialism. Democracy is even said to be inseparable from anarchism. It is identified with the good, the true, and the beautiful. There's a flavor of democracy for every taste. Constitutional democracy, liberal democracy, social democracy, Christian democracy, even industrial democracy. Poets, admittedly not many, have hymned its glory, and yet the suspicion lurks that, as it seemed to another poet, Oscar Wilde, quote, democracy means simply the bludgeoning of the people by the people and for the people. It has been found out, unquote. Found out and found to be unfounded. Until the 20th century, there were few democracies. Until the 19th century, the wisdom of the ages was unanimous in condemnation of democracy. All the sages of ancient Greece denounced it, especially the sages of democratic Athens. As Hegel wrote, quote, those ancients who, as members of democracies since their youth, had accumulated long experience and reflected profoundly about it, held different views on popular opinion from those more a priori views prevalent today, unquote. The framers of the U.S. Constitution rejected democracy. So did their opponents, the anti-federalists. The democracy which was then universally despised is what is now called direct democracy, government by the people over the people. Quote-unquote people in by the people meant the citizens, a minority consisting of some of the adult males. Quote-unquote people in over the people meant everybody. the citizenry assembled at intervals to wield state power by majority vote. This system no longer exists anywhere, and that makes it easier to believe in it, as Hegel observed. Democracy only became respectable in the 19th century when its meaning changed. Now it meant representative democracy, in which the citizenry, now an electorate, but still a minority, from time to time choose some of its rulers by majority vote, or rather by the majority of those actually voting, which is not the same thing. The elected rulers appoint the rest of the rulers. As always, some rule, and all are ruled. In the 19th century, when this system prevailed in only a few nations, it acquired a few intellectually able proponents, such as John Stuart Mill, but it also evoked some intellectually able opponents, such as Herbert Spencer, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and Friedrich Nietzsche. Democracy, as one of the ascendant political ideologies of the age, accommodated itself to the others, to liberalism, nationalism, socialism, and even Christianity. They in turn accommodated it, usually. Improbably, the doctrines legitimated one another, usually. The announced popularity of democracy is surely exaggerated. It's a mile wide and an inch deep. Aversion to authoritarian regimes is not necessarily enthusiasm for democracy. In some of the post-communist democracies, democracy has already lost its charm. In others, such as Russia, democracy itself is already lost. Older democracies persist more from apathy and force of habit than from genuine conviction. John Zerzan reasonably asks, quote, "Has there ever been so much incessant yammer about democracy and less real interest in it?" Unquote. Well, has there? The idea of democracy has never been justified, merely glorified. None of the older criticisms of democracy has been refuted, and neither has any of the newer ones. They come from left, right, and center. Some of these criticisms follow. They establish that democracy is irrational, inefficient, unjust, and antithetical to the very values claimed for it: liberty, equality, and fraternity. It does not even, for instance, imply liberty. Rather, the instinctive tendency of democracy is, quote, "to despise individual rights and take little account of them," unquote. Democracy not only subverts community, it insults dignity, and it affronts common sense. Not all of these violated values are important to everyone, but some of them are important to anyone, except to someone to whom nothing is important. That is why postmodernists are Democrats. In recent years, some intellectuals, academics, and former radicals have tried to revive direct democracy as an ideal and set it up as a viable alternative to representative democracy. Their strenuous exertions interest only themselves. Their efforts fail, for at least two reasons. The first reason is that, as a matter of fact, quote, "there is no reason to believe that there has ever been an urban, purely direct democracy, or even a reasonable approximation of one. Every known instance has involved a considerable admixture of representative democracy, which has sooner or later usually subordinated direct democracy, where it didn't eliminate it altogether," unquote. There is no space to prove it here, but the evidence is ample. Direct democracy is merely an abstract ideal, a fantasy, really, with no basis in historical experience. According to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is falsely claimed to be an advocate of direct democracy, quote, however small any state may be, civil societies are always too populous to be under the immediate government of all their members, unquote. The second reason is that the major objections to representative democracy also apply to direct democracy, even if the latter is regarded as an ideal form of pure majoritarian democracy. Some objections apply to one version, some to the other, but most apply to both. There are more than enough reasons to reject every version of democracy. Let us then consider some of these objections. Objections to democracy. 1. The majority isn't always right. As, among many others, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Henry David Thoreau, Mikhail Bakunin, Benjamin Tucker, Enrico Malatesta, and Emma Goldman said, and does anybody disagree? Democracy does not assure correct decisions. Quote, the only thing special about majorities is that they are not minorities. Unquote. There is no strength in numbers, or rather, there is nothing but strength in numbers. Parties, families, corporations, unions, nearly all voluntary associations are, by choice, oligarchic. Indeed, in assemblies, whether direct or representative, in electorates as in legislatures, the whole is less, even less, than the sum of its parts. It is even mathematically demonstrable, but not by me, that majority decision-making generates inefficient, socially wasteful, more or less self-defeating decisions. Besides, after all, why should anyone accept a decision that you know is wrong? Surely the quality of its decisions has something to do with the quality of the decision-making process. 2. Democracy does not, as is promised, give everyone the right to influence the decisions affecting her, because a person who voted on the losing side had no influence on that decision. As Henry David Thoreau wrote, quote, a minority is powerless while it conforms to the majority. It is not even a minority then, unquote. It is, in fact, powerless. It is nothing. Thomas Hobbes anticipated Thoreau, quote, and if the representative consist of many men, the voice of the greater number must be considered as the voice of them all. For if the lesser number pronounce, for example, in the affirmative, and the greater in the negative, there will be negatives more than enough to destroy the affirmatives, and thereby the excess of negatives, standing uncontradicted, are the only voice the representative hath. Unquote. Quote, the numerical majority, unquote, wrote John C. Calhoun, quote, is as truly a single power, and excludes the negative as completely as the absolute government of one or a few, unquote. Three, democracy, especially in small constituencies, lends itself to the disempowerment of permanent minorities, who occupy the same position in the democracy as they would in a despotism. It isn't always the same momentary majority that rules, but often it is, and shifting majorities only make it less likely, not unlikely, for some group to be always opposed to the winning gang. Under American democracy, it has long been well known, even to the U.S. Supreme Court in in 1938 that, quote, discrete and insular minorities, unquote, are at a political disadvantage beyond the mere fact, which is disadvantage enough, that they are minorities. And the smaller the constituency, the more likely it is that many interests may be represented, quote, by numbers so small as to be less than the minimum necessary for a defense of those interests in any setting, unquote. 4. Majority rule ignores the urgency of preferences. Preference varies in intensity, but consent does not. Preference is more or less. Consent is yes or no. The vote of a person who has only a slight preference for a candidate or measure counts the same as the vote of someone passionately opposed, and so, quote, a majority with slight preferences one way may outvote almost as many strong preferences the other way, unquote. There could even be, as just noted, a permanently frustrated minority, which is a source of instability or even oppression. To put it another way, the opportunity to influence a decision is not proportionate to one's legitimate interest in the outcome. Democratic theorists usually ignore the issue, or, like John Rawls, wave it away by dogmatizing that, quote, this criticism rests upon the mistaken view that the intensity of desire is a relevant consideration in enacting legislation, unquote. But, however embarrassing to Democrats, quote, the intensity question is absolutely vital to the stability of democratic systems, unquote, and it's a question to which pure majoritarian democracy has no answer. Rousseau at least recognized the problem, although his solution is impractical. He thought that, quote, the more grave and important the questions discussed, the nearer should the opinion that is to prevail approach unanimity, unquote. But there is no way in which to decide a priori the importance of a question. First, you have to decide how important the question is, and the majority may well rule a question to be unimportant to make sure that the question will be answered as that majority wishes. 5. There are no self-evident democratic voting rules. Majority or plurality, proxy voting, quorums are supermajorities, 3/5, 2/3 required for all, some, or none of the decisions. Who sets the agenda? Are motions from the floor entertained? Who decides who gets to speak, and for how long? And who gets the first or last word? Who schedules the meeting? Who adjourns it? And who decides, and by what rules, the answers to all these questions? Quote, if the participants disagree on the voting rules, they may first have to vote on these rules. But they may disagree on how to vote on the voting rules, which may make voting impossible, as the decision on how to vote is pushed further and further back, unquote. 6. Collective all-or-nothing balloting is irrational. A decision made on a momentous matter by a single vote is as valid as a unanimous vote on a trifle. That extreme rarity, the one time, one vote, one person's will makes a difference, is the very same situation, monarchy, dictatorship, one-man rule, that democracy is supposed to be an improvement on. At all other times, of all the votes for the winning side, only one is decisive, so the votes of all but one of the winners, like the votes of all of the losers, might as well not have been cast. 7. Majority rule is not even what it purports to be. It rarely means literally the majority of the people. Many people, such as children, foreigners, lunatics, transients, and felons, are everywhere denied the right to vote. The disenfranchised are never much short of being the majority, and sometimes they are the majority. And since it rarely happens that every one of the eligible voters votes every time, usually the resulting majority of a majority means plurality rule. In other words, the rule of the momentarily largest minority, which might be rather small. The majority of a majority is often, and the majority of a minority is always, a minority. In order to cobble together majorities out of incoherent assemblies, leaders usually wield literally decisive power. Under any possible government, a minority governs. 8. Whether voting by electoral districts or in popular assemblies, decisions are arbitrary because the boundaries of the districts determine the composition of their electorates, which determines the decisions. In a democracy, quote, the definition of the constituency within which the count is taken is a matter of primary importance, unquote. But democratic theory is unable to say who should be included in an electorate. Redraw the boundaries and the majority becomes a minority or vice versa, although no one has changed his mind. The politicians who draw and redraw the boundaries understand this very well. 9. Then there is the voter's paradox, a technical but very real contradiction in democracy discovered by Condorcet before the French Revolution. In every situation where 2 or more voters choose from 3 or more alternatives, if the voters choose consistently, the majority preference may be determined solely by the order in which the alternatives are voted on. It can happen that A is preferred to B is preferred to C, yet C is by the majority preferred to A. This is no mere theoretical possibility. It has happened in real votes. There are, in fact, a number of these voting paradoxes. Under ideal conditions, majority rule almost always produces these cyclical preference orders. For this and other reasons, quote, the various equilibrium conditions for majority rule are incompatible with even a very modest degree of heterogeneity of tastes, and for most purposes are not significantly less restrictive than the extreme condition of complete unanimity of individual preferences. Unquote. What that means is that whoever controls the agenda controls the vote, or at least, quote, that making agendas seems just about as significant as actually passing legislation, unquote. It is fitting that a 19th century mathematician who wrote on this phenomenon, which he called cyclical majorities, is better known under his pen name, Lewis Carroll. He came by his sense of the absurd honestly. 10. Another well-known method for thwarting majority rule with voting is log rolling. Log rolling is an exchange of votes between factions. Each group votes for the other group's measure, a measure which would otherwise be defeated because each group is in the minority. Note that this is not a compromise because the measures are unrelated. The factions aren't splitting the difference. In a sense, log rolling facilitates some accommodation of the urgency of preferences, since a faction only trades its votes for votes it values more highly, but it does so by bribery and to the detriment of deliberative democracy. No majority really approves of either measure enacted by log rolling, since if it did, there would be no need for log rolling, and those whose votes are unnecessary can be excluded from the log rolling process. The practice is common to representative and direct democracies. 11. In the unlikely event a legislative body eschews log rolling, it may succumb to gridlock. Consider a typical political issue, the building of a highway. A power plant or a garbage dump might be an even better example. Everyone wants a road, but no one wants it in his backyard. If 3 groups want a road, but not in their backyards, thank you, they will gang up to scotch the project. The road that everyone wants somewhere will not be built anywhere. That is an even worse outcome than with log rolling, where at least the road gets built somewhere and might be of some use to somebody. It isn't easy to say which is worse, a democracy that doesn't govern or a democracy that does. 12. Democracy, especially direct democracy, promotes disharmonious antisocial feelings. The psychology of the ecclesia, assembly, is the psychology of the agora, marketplace. Quote, voters and customers are essentially the same people. Mr. Smith buys and votes. He is the same man in the supermarket and the voting booth, unquote. Capitalism and democracy rose to dominance together as the goals of the same class, the bourgeoisie. Together they made a common world of selfish individualism, an arena of competition, not a field of cooperation. Democracy, like litigation, is an adversarial decision method. Quote, majority rule belongs to a combat theory of politics. It is a contest between opposing forces, and the outcome is victory for one side and defeat for the other, unquote. Indeed, as George Simmel noticed, majority rule is really the substituted equivalent of force. Quote, we agree to try strength by counting heads instead of breaking heads. The minority gives way not because it is convinced that it is wrong, but because it is convinced that it is a minority, unquote. Literally having to face an opponent publicly may provoke aggression, anger, and competitive feelings. In a winner-take-all system, there is no incentive to compensate or conciliate defeated minorities who have been told, in effect, that not only are they not to get their way, they are also stigmatized as wrong. The unaccountable majority is arrogant. The defeated minority is resentful. Coercive voting promotes polarization and hardens positions. Deliberation, quote, can bring differences to the surface, widening rather than narrowing them, unquote. These consequences, muted in systems of large-scale, secret voting in not-too-frequent elections, are accentuated in the imagined communal combination of very small electorates, extremely frequent elections, and public voting. Citizens will take their animosities and ulcers home with them and act them out in everyday life. Elections are undesirable everywhere, but nowhere would they be more destructive of community than in face-to-face assemblies and neighborhoods. 13. Another source of majority irresponsibility and minority indignity is the felt frivolity of voting, its element of chance and arbitrariness. As Thoreau, quoted by Emma Goldman, put it, quote, all voting is a sort of gaming, like checkers or backgammon, with a slight moral tinge to it, a playing with right and wrong, with moral questions, and betting naturally accompanies it, unquote. Majority rule is majority roulette. The popularity of student government and Model UN confirms that there is a ludic playing around element to deliberative decision-making, which is independent of its consequences. Here is an interest the delegates share with each other, but not with their constituents. Voting is a contest, officially umpired by the majority, with sometimes high stakes, to the extent that the assembled citizens are playing games with each other, or that winning for its own sake, or for how you play the game for that matter, plays any part in their motivation, the quality of decision-making is reduced still further, and the humiliation of submission to majority rule is that much deepened. 14. Under representative democracy with electoral districts, malapportionment, the creation of districts with unequal populations is possible, and even if they are equal, gerrymandering is almost inevitable. Modern Democrats agree with H.L. Mencken that, quote, it must be plain that a community whose votes, man for man, count for only half as much as the votes of another community is one in which half of the citizens are, to every practical intent, unable to vote at all, unquote. Even if, as currently in the United States, districts are required to be nearly equal in population, gerrymandering, the drawing of their boundaries so as to favor some candidate or party, is a standing temptation, especially since the incumbents do the drawing. Using the latest liberatory technology, the computer, it's easy to devise gerrymandered but mathematically equal districts. 15. Direct democracy trying to avert this evil embraces federalism, which increases inequality. If the neighborhood or face-to-face basic units were autarkic, self-governing and self-sufficient, it would be nobody's business but theirs which people they included and how many. They could go to hell in their own way. But schemes for direct democracy typically call for a federal system with layers of, quote, mandated and revocable delegates responsible to the base, unquote, by which the decisions of assemblies are reconciled. Some delegates to the higher levels will potentially speak for a different number of citizens than other delegates, but cast equal votes. In a federal system of units of unequal population, voting equality for the units means voting inequality for individuals. The federalist but single-member, simple plurality system evidently contemplated by most direct Democrats, including the syndicalists, is the least proportionate of all voting systems. The inequality will be compounded at every higher level. The majority of the majority, the majority of the majority of the majority. The higher up you go, the greater the inequality. The more often you multiply by a fraction, the smaller the number you arrive at. Quote, it is not possible, unquote, it is said, quote, to find a general answer to the question of to what extent federalism may legitimately be allowed to outweigh democracy, unquote. Actually, there is a general answer to the question. The answer is no. A direct Democrat who claims that an overarching confederal system produces majority decisions affirms the impossible as an act of faith. 16. Direct democracy, to an even greater degree than representative democracy, encourages emotional, irrational decision-making. The face-to-face context of assembly politics engenders strong interpersonal psychological influences which are, at best, extraneous to decision-making on the merits. The crowd is susceptible to orators and stars, and intolerant of contradiction. The speakers, in the limited time allotted to them, tend to sacrifice reasoning to persuasion whenever they have to choose, if they want to win. As Hobbes wrote, the speakers begin not from true principles, but from, quote, commonly accepted opinions, which are for the most part usually false, and they do not try to make their discourse correspond to the nature of things, but to the passions of men's hearts. The result is that votes are cast not on the basis of correct reasoning, but on emotional impulse. Unquote. Quote, pure democracy, like pure rum, easily produces intoxication, and with it 1,000 mad pranks and foolishness. Unquote. Dissenters feel intimidated, as they were, for instance, when the Athenian assembly voted for the disastrous Sicilian expedition. Quote, the result of this excessive enthusiasm of the majority was that the few who were actually opposed to the expedition were afraid of being thought unpatriotic if they voted against it, and therefore kept quiet. Unquote. 17. A specific, experimentally validated emotional influence vitiating democracy is group pressure to conform. This was strikingly demonstrated in a famous experiment by social psychologist Solomon Asch. Each of 7 to 9 experimental subjects was asked to compare a series of lines, and in each case identify the 2 lines that were equal in length. For each comparison it was obvious, indeed extremely obvious, which lines matched. But time after time, every member of the group gave the same wrong answer, except the only subject who was unaware of the real purpose of the experiment. In these circumstances, 58% of the test subjects changed their answer to agree with the unanimous majority, even when subjects were each given one ally. 13% of the subjects agreed with the group instead of the evidence of their senses. Some of the conformists actually changed their perceptions, but most of them simply decided that the group must be right, no matter how strong was the evidence to the contrary. 18. Another inherent flaw in direct democracy, partly, not entirely, a consequence of the previous one, is the inconstancy of policy. This really covers 2 related arguments against democracy. What the assembly does at one meeting, it may undo at the next, whether because citizens have had sober second thoughts, a good reason, or because a different mix of people shows up, a bad reason. This often happened in classical Athens, the only polity which has ever seriously tried to make direct democracy work. For example, the assembly voted to give the Mytileneans, whose revolt had been crushed, the Melian treatment: death for all the men, slavery for the women and children. The judgment was reversed the next day. The second ship dispatched to Mytilene happily arrived first, and so only the Mytileneans held mainly responsible, over 1,000 of them, were executed. Better, of course, to reverse a bad decision than to stick to it, but people are reluctant to publicly admit they were wrong. It is bad enough if the composition of the assembly fluctuates randomly, or because of politically extraneous factors, as the weather, for instance, influences American election outcomes by influencing voter turnout, higher proportions of Democrats turn out in good weather. But it might well turn on deliberate mobilization by a faction. This too happened in Athens. The general Nicias, addressing the assembly in opposition to the proposed Sicilian expedition, stated, quote, "It is with real alarm that I see this young man's Alcibiades party sitting at his side in this assembly, all called in to support him, and I, on my side, call for the support of the older men among you." Unquote. A line by the satiric playwright Aristophanes also attests to block voting in the assembly. Hobbes observed that, quote, "when the votes are sufficiently close for the defeated to have hopes of winning a majority at a subsequent meeting, if a few men swing round to their way of thinking, their leaders get them all together, and they hold a private discussion on how to revoke the measure that has just been passed. They resolve among themselves to attend the next meeting in large numbers and to be there first. They arrange what each should say and in what order, so that the question may be brought up again, and the decision that was made when their opponents were there in strength may be reversed when they fail to show." Unquote. Hobbes exactly describes how Samuel Adams manipulated another assembly, the Boston Town Meeting, at prior private meetings of his faction at the Caucus Club. Quote, "Caucusing involved the widest provision of problems that might arise and the narrowest choice of response to each possibility. Who would speak to any issue, and what he would say, with the clubman's general consent guaranteed ahead of time to both choice of speaker and what the speaker's message would be." Unquote. His cousin John Adams was astonished, after many years of attending town meetings, to learn of this. Quote, "There they drink flip, a rum drink, I suppose, and there they choose a moderator who puts questions to the vote regularly, and select men, assessors, wardens, fire wards, and representatives are regularly chosen before they are chosen by the town." Unquote. Exactly the same methods of manipulation were practiced in the Athenian assembly. Direct democracy is well suited to machine politics. Quote, "The powerful town meeting in Boston named the many municipal officials, determined taxes and assessments, and adopted public service projects that were a rich source of jobs and economic largesse. For years, the original caucus and its allies in the Merchants' Club had acted as the unofficial directing body of the town meeting, in which caucus stalwart Sam Adams played a key role." Unquote. This is democracy in action. What Hobbes is talking about, as he proceeds to say, is faction, which he defines as, quote, "a sort of effort and hard work, which they use to fashion people." Unquote. James Madison famously argued that direct democracy promotes factionalism, but an organization of organizers of votes serves a purpose, its own, in any assembly or legislature. Parties, the euphemism for factions, could play central roles in a direct democracy, maybe greater roles than in representative democracy. Only high turnouts would minimize, not eliminate, these capricious or manipulated reversals, since, if most citizens attend every meeting, most of them who attend one meeting will attend another. The polar possibilities are that all the same people or all different people attend the next meeting. If it is all the same people, it is de facto oligarchy. If it is all different people, it is chaos, the only kind of quote-unquote anarchy consistent with direct democracy. It will usually turn out to be closer to oligarchy. Conclusion. Majority rule is as arbitrary as random decision, but not nearly as fair. For a voter, the only difference between the lottery and an election is that he might win the lottery. Better pure chance than quote, pure democracy or the immediate autocracy of the people, unquote, as Joel Barlow described it, a celebrant of Swiss direct democracy at its height admits, quote, corruption, factionalization, arbitrariness, violence, disregard for law, and an obdurate conservatism that opposed all social and economic progress were pathologies to some extent endemic to the pure democratic life form, unquote. Democracy in any form is irrational, unjust, inefficient, capricious, divisive, and demeaning. Its direct and representative versions, as we have seen, share many vices. Neither version exhibits any clear advantage over the other. Each also has vices peculiar to itself. Indeed, the systems differ only in degree. Either way, the worst tyranny is the tyranny of the majority, as most anarchists and some conservatives and some liberals and even the more honest Democrats have often said. Is democracy nonetheless the best form of government? Even that is not so obvious. After taking a hard look at just how bad it is, its theory is reducible to ruins in a few pages. The believers claim that democracy promotes dialogue, but where is the dialogue about democracy itself? Democrats ignore their critics, as if democracy is such a done deal. Why bother to defend it? They just take it for granted that somebody, Locke, Rousseau, Lincoln, Churchill, has long since made out a strong case for democracy. Nobody ever did. That's why you didn't learn it in school. You were just told to believe. The arguments for democracy, which aren't often articulated, are so flawed and flimsy, some of them even so silly that pious Democrats might be startled. Now, it may be that some of these criticisms of democratic government are really criticisms of government itself. That does not detract from, but rather enhances their validity. That just means that democracy is not so special after all, and that it has been found out. Vote nobody. Nobody tells the truth. Okay. Alright, so yeah, that's the end of that one. And I'm just going to go to the top. So yeah, I put the link to those two essays in the description. If you want to, read them yourself, and especially that second essay has a lot of references, and quotes and all that, and so you can, follow up on the references there if you want to do that. So, yeah, I guess I'll just, give some of my thoughts here. Yeah, it's kind of a lot. Talking about democracy. So the first issue is as the essay said, we never go into that. Like when does anyone really truly explore even the underlying justifications and arguments and whatnot? for democracy, um, you know, uh, it really is just a belief system. And, that's really the role that, you know, schooling, so called education, and socialization, plays, is to just teach people to believe in certain things, and that's it. And that's what really kind of gets to me is, as I mentioned at the beginning, um, there's just such a narrow, view of anything. Like I said, you have the two major parties, and I'm speaking for the U.S. I can't speak to any other country. I don't know about them, so I'm not going to speak to those other countries. But yeah, in the U.S., you have the two major parties. Then you have some third party candidates and some independent people running sometimes, and that's it. And you know, it seems like there's been a lot of focus on, a lot of people potentially um, becoming more open to, like, candidates who are outside of the two major parties, but even that is just, really questionable. Um, and I think um, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, where I'm at with things is I just, you know wish people would really evaluate, reevaluate, things that they have been raised to just believe in, and actually wouldn't be reevaluated if they never evaluated in the first place. So that's the thing, right? I think, the things that we see going on with politics, with electoral um, systems, it's just such a mess. I mean, no one's happy. It's just such a pageant and a game of, as some of the things mentioned in the second essay, especially, like, you know rhetoric. People are easily swayed by speeches, right? I mean, it's, over the years that I've watched, politics, and heard people's, what you hear from the mainstream and all that around politics is like, you have to appeal to people, and, appeal to as many people as possible. And it's like, and then, so yeah, what comes out of that is just nothing. Like, nothing that people even, when polled, certain things that supposedly a majority of people want still don't, never happen, or they happen in extremely watered down ways. There's just always some excuse. And I just wonder what it would take for people to stop playing this game, because, I really don't know. I just don't know, like, who in their right mind thinks anything good can come of this, like any legitimate change. And that's the point that's made, is that that's the system as it is, because we are just taught to believe in um, democracy. I mean, right? I mean, that's what we're hearing this year, especially. Democracy is on the ballot, right? According to the Democratic side of the aisle, if Trump wins, that'll be the end of democracy. And Democrats are claiming to be somehow the people who can rescue this so-called democracy. And so, but again, of course, there's no examination of what that means. And yeah, just, we all know that it's just touted as, that's the gold standard, and, the best system in the world, all this fucking nonsense, propaganda that people have been raised to believe in, as if it means anything. And it doesn't mean anything. People couldn't even define, any of those things. And so I don't know. It's you know it's a belief system. I mean, that's the thing. Like everything that happens is based on these different ideologies that people believe in. So that's what I'm wondering is like what would it take for people to give up these ideologies that are leading nowhere, doing absolutely nothing for the vast majority of, just regular people, in the US, for example. Just this ping ponging back and forth of, Democrat and then getting tired of Democrat and then trying Republican, getting tired of Republican. It's like, where's this going? And, and as was said with like the third parties, even if, even if some of the third party candidates have at least like, you know, supposed positions and platforms that on their face, look better than what's being offered by the Democrats and Republicans. The reality is that's still within this whole system, and like if you're being honest with yourself, there's very little that just a president would be able to do. Like there's even if I were to give like say a third party candidate the benefit of the doubt that they genuinely care about the things that they say in their platform and all that they're not some kind of like you know um, like that they don't sell out, for example, that they don't immediately just sell out or whatever, like say they actually do believe in whatever things and they want to do those things. I mean, in reality, it's just very unlikely that anything significant can change. That's how the system is set up. That it's checks and balances. And that the president, yeah, they can't dramatically change things just by themselves. And so again, you run into all those same issues with obviously the Congress. I mean, we've seen examples of that over the years. How difficult it is to get anything that people actually even want that would actually help people passed. Like it's it just isn't working. So I just think people need to let go of just all of these things that they've been raised to believe in and go outside of it, and to really be willing to like explore what's beyond all this. And because there's just no future in playing these games, that have been created this way to maintain the structures of power as they are. I mean, as was mentioned, it's just really hard to make any real change. And they're set up that way. And as you know, one of the things mentioned in the essay said, it's like, there's all these, like even the rules, like who creates the rules about how those systems work? It's like no one even asks that. I mean, certain things get criticized here and there. Of course, there's criticism about the Supreme Court and the supermajority and all these things, but it's like even aside from that, there's so many other I mean, that's the whole point, the whole thing. Like, why do people accept it? And so, that's just what's hard for me to really have to watch, day in and day out, is just people accepting the premise that's laid out, because there's just no future within this premise. So it's like, there's just something about the human condition that most people are really not able to go beyond what's kind of taught to them, what's put in front of them. And anyone trying to really go to this level of criticism or challenging is just kind of dismissed. It's like I don't know. And so that's kind of where I've over the years I really have gotten to a point where it's like I don't think there's a yeah there I don't think there's a political solution to like any of the all of the things just going on, um, because what underlies the politics is people's mentality. Like I'm saying, it's like either people find a way to go beyond all these systems that just don't work, or they don't, or they stay trapped in these systems forever playing games. And that's not a political question. That's and that's how one defines that is a complicated thing. Some people might call it spiritual or whatever, but it's not something that can come about just by picking some ideology, right? Whether it's all the different ideologies that have been out there, whether it's capitalism, communism, socialism, parliamentarianism. I mean, yeah, all of these things. It's like um, there's just a persistent, the human element of like where there's power, it ends up being, you know, removed from the average person in such a way to make whatever it is meaningless, whatever it claims itself to be. Whether it calls itself a democracy or whatever. And it's really an ideological issue of whether people can ever find a way to overcome their conditioning into buying into and believing just all of these things that they're taught, or whether they just don't. And that's what I'm saying. There's just no, not just in no easy way, but I don't know of any particular way to facilitate that happening. I mean, I know I spent a while in all kinds of like political groups, and on different sides too. I've been with like the more right-leaning libertarians. I've been with the whatever socialists, communists, and they all run into the same issue of like, how do you really get through to people, and not just trying to come up with like, okay, this system, we should have this system, and which even in itself, like, yeah, again, how would that even come about? But frankly, like, yeah, even if you change the system, would people not still have the same issues? I guess I get one example I'll just throw out to try and explain that is, because I've been around like the whole debate about like corporations versus government, right? That's kind of the idea of like the capitalist versus socialist, right? The idea that capitalism is theoretically decentralized, in that things are up to individual businesses, um, and as opposed to like a centralized central planning, in a socialism or communist society. Well, again, the problem comes back to power, because it's like, I mean, and I think the first essay mentioned like this, a small state, and I've been through this even on the libertarian side. There's people who are like what they call minarchists. They want a small government, right? And then there's people who are like, who say, well, if it's like small in what way? First of all, like, what things do you consider what you would keep, right? And then, like, some would say like police and military is the only thing you would keep, and everything else you'd get rid of. And then one criticism I heard of that was who said, well, the police and the military are like the worst parts of the state, so you want to keep the worst parts, right? I mean, so that's the thing. It's like, um, you know, there's just so much, there's no real cohesion um, about anything, and that's kind of the core of the issue, right? Is like it said, it comes down to just trying to win, trying to get what you want, and get as opposed to what other people want. And the idea that just a majority wanting it is makes it legitimate is really just garbage. you know it's just not. And that, like I said, and people will respond to that by saying like it's better than dictatorship or this and that. And it's like, to me that's just not enough. Like, it's like the whole idea of the lesser of two evils. It's like you can always make that argument. And like I said, to me it's a result of people being trapped mentally, when they resort to just saying, oh well, it's better than such and such. It's like, how long are people going to keep those standards? To me, they're just really low standards of saying like it's, something, one thing is 1% better than something else, and that means it's, you know, people will just cling to that as a good thing. I don't know, but um, but yeah. Anyway, yeah. So I was trying to say, like, as far as power goes, power is. Um, I think there is something to that idea of like there are people who just have a certain personality, whatever you want to call it, and like narcissist or psychopath, sociopath. We have all these words, but there are people who genuinely don't have what most people would consider like a conscience. Like they genuinely don't care about you know how how anything affects other people, um, and that those kinds of people essentially will rise to, quote unquote, rise to the positions of power in any system. So whether it's a centralized like communist system, or it's a system of corporations or separate businesses, that people who really have no empathy and no conscience will end up in the positions of power regardless. So, because like one thing I would hear in those debates of like, the capitalist versus communist or whatever is like, the centralized state is, they're tyrannical, and as opposed to be having separate businesses administrating the economy. But the problem is like, and frankly, yeah, I don't see any evidence that the heads of corporations are any better people than anyone in the government. So it's like there's like a saying that I had heard, and then and then on the other side, people who think that having like a centralized government would protect people from, say, the CEO type, um, sociopathic or psychopathic people. But all the same, it's like, who's in those positions? I mean, they could be just as bad. So there's no reason to assume that a centralized government um, would actually protect people. Like, I think the saying was, it's like you don't trust people, you think people are bad, but then you want to put people, you want to create bureaucracies of people to protect you from those people. I mean, that's the problem, is that people, um, there is just, yeah, any person could become, not any person, but like I said, I don't think most people necessarily would have that kind of corruption. But the reality is that that's why most people that don't end up in those positions, and that the people who really don't have a conscience and all that do. And that's, I think humanity is kind of stuck in that, across systems. I'm really not convinced that, a so-called socialist system has achieved, having basically a benevolent government, right? Because I've been around some of those circles, and like some of them believe that like China, for example, or Cuba, that they have a government that is totalitarian, and like they'll say that, like, yeah, it is, dictatorial in a sense, because they're protecting the interests of the masses of people against influences that would hurt them. But you know that's just talk. um, I'm not convinced by that at all. I really gave it an honest appraisal. I'm not somebody who just grew up in a mentality of like all commies are bad and yay America. I actually gave a true appraisal to like ideas of socialism and communism, but I'm really not convinced that like the Chinese government, for example, is truly doing what some people claim it is. That it is truly acting in the interests of the regular working people, as opposed to people who are also wealthy billionaires. Like there's billionaires in China, and some people who even consider themselves socialist will admit that and say that, yeah, China isn't socialist because it's like the idea of socialism was to have a kind of classless society, economically classless. So how can you claim that when you have ultra rich people and you have people who are also very poor? At best, maybe they have some more programs than a place like the U.S. or whatever. I don't know. I can't say. I haven't been there, but yeah, overall, I don't buy that. It's what some people claim, that it's truly like solve the problem of massive wealth, being hoarded by just a few people and everyone else having to struggle just to have basic things. Like, I don't think it's solved that. Um, so yeah, it's about, yeah, to me it's about ideology. It's about if people are able to find a way to stop looking to leaders, and that's the problem in whatever system. Like people just want to believe in some leader, that leader will carry out their promises and all this, and I just don't see where that's really happened. Um, Especially not in the U.S. I mean, again, I'm not going to make any absolute pronouncements about whatever other countries. If I since I don't know about them, I can't speak to that. But I'm personally not convinced that any are much better, because of the issue. I think it is a human issue of that basically shitty people will be the ones to put themselves in positions of power, and people who frankly most of us would consider better, more decent people, just for whatever reason don't have the personality that they would be in those positions. And so it's really this difficult position. So and yeah, I unfortunately I have seen many people in the context of the U.S. Politics, who seem to have, yeah, bought into so many different people, at least of my age group, people in like their 30s and 40s. It mostly goes back to like Obama, of course, right? A lot of people, obviously, he was popular at the time. I mean, especially the first time, obviously, even by Obama's reelection, people were already disillusioned with him, because obviously, again, he did the same things that all the politicians do after, and unfortunately, I mean, that's what I'm saying, the phenomenon of people being swayed by his rhetoric, really wanting to believe that he was different and all this stuff, and obviously it didn't happen. And unfortunately, yeah, people who fell for that, and then they, got disillusioned with him, and then they went on to fall for something else, whoever it is, whether it's, Trump or Bernie Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard. And, I don't know. That's what I'm saying. I don't know what, that's really the mystery, that would really need to be, um, the mystery of why people just keep falling for people who don't give a shit about them. People who are just professional liars. And will people just always be that way? I mean, the majority of people be like these sheep-like creatures, just always being swayed by one form of propaganda or another. I don't know. I mean, it's just pretty disheartening, to see that process seem to play out over and over and over. Um, and yeah, I mean that the core issues just always get totally ignored in favor of like low hanging fruit. Like that is emotional. We all know that the so-called wedge issues or the culture war issues just stir people in a way that the things like surveillance or the military industrial complex or issues of healthcare and obviously just average people being able to have a home, own a home and have a decent life. Like those things are just ignored completely more and more as time goes on. It's like things are just getting worse and not better within this system. So um, yeah, I think so. I guess all of that to say, yeah, I've kind of given up on like the idea that there's a political answer, right? After having kind of explored a lot of different of these perspectives, it comes down to the human condition and by what process can a change take place, and that's a very difficult thing to approach, and I know that's why it's hard for people to let go of the politics because it seems concrete. The idea of like different political ideologies and or candidates and this and that the other seems concrete. People don't want to hear like you know well, I don't know what the answer is, or that it's something we don't know. It's something beyond all of our preconceived, accepted beliefs and the things we think we know about how things have to work or whatever. That's just clearly it's not something that people want to hear. But yeah, I think yeah, the only solution is something that hasn't been categorized, hasn't been defined even, um, you know, till this point, and that's what makes it seem really abstract to a lot of people, uh, and it makes sense, but really I don't understand how people can keep playing these games within what's laid out, what we're supposed to believe in, and think that something different is going to come out of it. I mean, isn't that the quote? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. I mean, I don't know. So yeah, in some ways I've kind of become more interested in like what might be called spiritual things, because that does deal with the human condition more directly. And as someone, it's been an interesting thing because I came from like a place where I was raised like in Catholicism, and then like a lot of people, I rebelled against it when I was a teenager and all that, and became like staunchly atheist and even like anti like anti religion and anti like spirituality and all this stuff. But over the last couple of years I really, even the concept of like sin, right? And of course that's something I really rebelled against, the idea of like you know being told that people are bad and deserve to be punished or deserve to go to hell. And so what I want to say about that is not that I believe in that in a literal sense. Like I don't think I don't really believe in like a literal hell type thing or a literal heaven necessarily. I'm not I'm kind of, you might say, agnostic. I'm not saying one way or the other whether I know or don't know whether they exist in a literal sense, but even just in a symbolic sense, it makes the idea of sin, right, of people just having, what could be called vices or whatever, um, having, or might be called character defects, if you're familiar with language in like in the 12-step programs, like the idea that there are just issues within the human condition, um, that, yeah, I mean, whether it's greed, right, greed, and lust for power, lust for whatever, and that's what I'm getting at. It's like, yeah, how can people really change? Because, yeah, I mean, that has to happen first before any, the system and the society, and the those manifestations of people can change, because it starts with people themselves, right? So, if I mean, yeah, it makes sense for people needing to be the ones to change before anything else can change. Like, the idea that a system, imposing any particular system will cause people to change is, really not um, seemed to happen. The idea of like for example, the USSR, like trying to create a revolution and change the system, and that people will be changed by kind of imposing that kind of system. Like, it really didn't happen. It didn't solve all of these fundamental things that most people are really challenged by, other than, of course, as I said, the small amount of people who end up in the rulership class, or whatever you want to call it. um, and yeah, and it's um, and okay, I guess the last thing I'll say is that, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of the idea of like the ruling class or the elites or whatever. Um, I mean, yeah, there's people. I mean, that's how things manifest themselves. Like, yeah, there's people, a very small amount of people who have power, have wealth, and all that. The issue that I have sometimes with how people use that is to kind of totally disempower like everyone else, and say, like, everyone, the majority of people are just these like helpless sheep, right? And that if only the rulers weren't manipulating them and propagandizing them. The issue is that maybe they're, I don't know if this is the right term, but taking some kind of responsibility, like, just be casting the majority of people as like helpless victims, I don't think necessarily helps. um, Again, I don't know what that looks like, because, yeah, I mean, it's not like people just can snap their fingers and like change, like undo all the conditioning and propaganda. But at the same time, it's like, again, either people change, they take, they stop buying into things, stop buying into the lies and propaganda, or they don't. So, how, and that's the difficult thing, like how that can actually happen. Because, yeah, I'm not. It's definitely not a simple thing, but it's also not. But it is kind of just, yeah. It would be like defeatist to just say, like, well, there's, people are just always gonna do what they're told to do by these, people in power. It's like, well, then I guess, yeah, you may as well just say fuck it. And I guess that a lot of people have done that already. They have given up on anything, radically changing in any fundamental way. But, yeah, I mean, that's kind of just, the things that I question. I don't want to just assume that that can't happen, that people can't really change, have like a genuine change, and get outside of these prescribed systems. But it's certainly very daunting. So, um, yeah, to contemplate that. And yeah, whether one wants to call it like spiritual or just psychological or whatever, it doesn't have to be, you know, doesn't have to be associated with with religion or spirituality, like, but something has to, yeah, something about people has to change. It has to start from within. And, yeah, no amount of imposition, whether it's through this so-called democracy, majority rule, voting in something or someone, trying to impose it. We've done all that, and look where it's gotten us, nowhere. So yeah, um, that's just where I'm at, and just kind of questioning all that. And it's pretty deep, and that's why I just kind of wanted to put that out there. If I could, I mean, I'm not very good at kind of articulating things in a way that's appealing, right? That's why I'm not a YouTuber. I'm not able to make things seem really appealing, and or very simple and very concise, or visually appealing clearly. um, but that's the thing. It's like what we got is not going anywhere. The things that people are drawn to don't seem to be helping them get anywhere, get beyond all these things. It just seems very, just very limited and very narrow, just being trapped. So yeah. And so that's, I guess that's, I'll just stop rambling there. I might read some other things in the next couple weeks. We'll see. So that's all I got. If you listen to all this, I mean, well, that's cool. Thanks. Have a good one.